This is the real Nate question, okay. But because he's been known around the league prior to you coming to Colorado and getting to know him a little bit more firsthand, has your perception of him changed if you learned a little bit more about who he is as a player? We are back with another edition of On the Road. I'm Meghan Angley, and today I'm joined by Corey Masisak of the Denver Post. And you've covered a lot of hockey before you got here. I wanted you to introduce yourself to the Avs base if they haven't already familiarized themselves with you. What was your path through hockey and how did you end up in Colorado?
Yeah, I've been a lot of places. I joked with some people that I'm running out of places to go. I grew up in Western Pennsylvania. I went to school in Maryland, and I got my first hockey job covering the Washington Capitals in D.C., and then I spent some time in New York City working for NHL.com. And then a couple other things happened. I ended up working for The Athletic. And so I covered the Devils and the Sharks for The Athletic. And then this summer, got a job in Denver covering the Avalanche. So that's kind of the long and winding how I got here.
And I remember in the regular season, because you had come from covering the Sharks before this, there was a game that the Avs had won, and you had made a comment like, if this was the Sharks, they would have been ecstatic. And their reaction in the Avs room post-game was very regular. And we hear from the new additions like Wood and Colton how there's a culture difference in Colorado. And I wanted to know, because you have covered a lot of teams, what you've noticed as a member of the media with the culture in Colorado.
Yeah, and it was... Actually, one of the first kind of fun stories that I did covering the team was I asked Miles and Ross and basically all the new guys during training camp, like, this is new for me too. Like, what is new about this for you, right? And so it is. It's like the team that I can compare them to the most is the Capitals, because they were very good when I started covering it was like young Alex Ovechkin, young Nicholas Backstrom, young Mike Green. The difference is that team was kind of like in the, let's call it like the 2018 to 2021 Avs phase where they were learning how to win. And so it was just a lot of, they'd win a game 6-5 and people would say, the same old run and gun Capitals don't know how to, kind of the same thing that the Maple Leafs are going through right now, where everyone has an opinion about how they should play.
Yeah.
Here, that stuff is over, right? Like, they know how they play. They know when they're good, they know when they're bad. There's never any maybe they should play a certain way because they've lost a few games in a row. All of that kind of it's kind of nonsense whenever it probably doesn't feel like it to Maple Leafs fans, but once they figure that out and they get the right GM and the right coach and the right players, that culture stuff just, look, maybe not everybody can have Nathan MacKinnon and Cale Makar and Devon Toews and Mikko Rantanen to kind of set it the way that they do. I think that's probably the biggest thing is that this is the one of the few teams probably, I don't know what we say ever in the NHL, but certainly now where it's like you ask Sean Walker or Josh Manson, anybody who's come here from another place, and they immediately say, it's Nate, it's Cale, it's Gabe, right? Like, those guys, they set everything, the standard, how hard they practice, when they practice. Everybody talks about the stuff they do after practices, the work ethic, all that stuff. They just, the Avalanche found the right 3 or 4 guys to build around, and they have this kind of perfect culture now.
I wondered too if the dynamic that you see in the room, and granted when we're in there as media, we're not really seeing the dynamic completely, but is there anything different you notice in how the players interact with each other?
I don't know about with each other. Yeah, you're right. We don't really get to see. That's part of the one thing that's a little bit different with Colorado is some days we get in there and there's just nobody.
Yeah,
there, right?
They could be.
It's weird. We have days where it's we get to talk to 5 or 6 different people, and it's you really feel like you got a good sense of what's going on with the team with it. And then there are other days where it's hey, it's time to talk to Andrew Cogliano or Jack Johnson again. Or maybe again. Yeah, but no, it's it's very. How do I want to put it? It's I always find it funny. I feel like Nate kind of goes out of his way to tell us that they have fun, right? There's the whole this is fun.
Right.
It's part of the whole.
It's quite really a sign.
It's a sign, right? And I think that stems from the outside perception of the Avalanche is that they're a bunch of maniacs, right? And that Nate is a maniac, with his fitness and the diet and all that stuff that's come before this. They do whenever we're in there, they do they chirp each other. Yeah. They're always talking about so and so had a great goal during some drill or whatever. Yes. I do think it's a pretty tight group. I think every team says that or feels that, but it does feel. And the one thing about the culture that has stood out to me from like day 3, the first time I ever talked to Nate, well, like just me and him, I asked him about like, hey, Miles said this and Ross said this about this place, and he was like, some people just don't fit here. And that line, that just one line has stuck with me because like I did spend a lot of time around Sidney Crosby when he was younger, and then kind of in Nate's stage of his career now. Since Ray with the media, he talks every day. Sid would never say, yeah, some guys just don't fit here. Like Nate is very honest sometimes. Like maybe he doesn't realize it, but I do think that like they kind of weed out the people that don't fit. Like right, like they bring people in, they don't fit, they go out, and so I do think they eventually, like 2 years ago, maybe right now, they've kind of got that group of 20 or 25 guys that's like, this is our group.
And we're here in Dallas, embroiled in the second round of the playoffs. I wanted to know your initial thoughts on Game 1, in particular, if anything surprised you.
So the first thing that surprised me in Game 1 was like the first period. There was like 2 or 3 plays where the Stars did something really well defensively, and I was like, oh, okay, maybe this is going to be a little different than Winnipeg. And then the second and third period felt very much like Winnipeg, right? Like it was just like, oh, okay, no, actually it does seem like the one thing that I didn't know before the playoffs started, because I do think like just from being around a bunch of different teams, I spent 82 games or whatever, 75 games around these guys during the regular season. I've already learned more about this team in the last 2 weeks than I really thought I knew over the first 6 months. The stuff that happens right now matters just so much more than what happened, when they lost 7-0 to Winnipeg or whatever, right? So I do think that like the one kind of question I had, because I wasn't here in 2022 or 2019 or whatever, was like, what do they do when things go wrong in the playoffs, yes. Right? And like I did spend, when I was at NHL.com, I covered like 40 Blackhawks playoff games during that run and I do kind of think like the Avalanche, like that's where we're headed with them, right? They're going to be compared to the Blackhawks, the Sidney Crosby Penguins. And that was the thing with the Blackhawks, is they would have games almost every round where they just looked like crap. Like it was like, oh man, if they played too much, all the questions would come out. And then the series would be 2-2, and then they would win 4-2. Like the Blackhawks record, Game 5 and Game 6 was insane. And what the Avalanche have done since Game 1 against Winnipeg, and then even from the first period to the second period against Dallas, it's like, oh, okay, maybe they do have that, like, we fix things quickly here. Gene?
It was an observation I had too initially about how Dallas was clearing pucks out of their end quickly and not allowing second and third attempts, and then Nathan MacKinnon is just not above dump and chase hockey if he needs to play that way. And I think that this next question, it's a MacKinnon question. One, and I don't mean to put you on the spot, did you vote for him for the first place spot in your heart ballot?
Yeah, I did. Yeah.
Okay, and he already thanked us for voting for him. Now he gets a nod for the Ted Lindsay Award. Do you think he'll talk to us about it?
Yeah, right. No problem. I'm guessing it'll be the same. Actually, it would not surprise me, given the way that I think I've got Nate figured out a little bit, like how he's wired. I think he'll be like 2% more excited about the Ted Lindsay.
It's like it's peers.
Right. It is a weird thing. The Hart Trophy is definitely the most like well-known, recognized. People's careers are defined by the Hart Trophy. Like the legends are defined by the. But like I do think that a lot of the players, especially the ones that are like really, really wired, the way that Nate, Sid, etc. are, like they get a little more like if they had to choose between the two, I think they would secretly probably say like I'd rather win the Lindsay, which is totally fine. Like I mean, it's a bunch of us schmucks, right? Voting for him on the one, and it's his player. Yeah, so I do think, and I wrote this right at the end of the season. I do think he's going to win. I think it's a crazy field. The fact that Austin Matthews is going to finish fourth in the Hart Trophy voting, he had an amazing season. He would win most years,
right?
But he's going to finish fourth because there are 4 incredible players. They all had amazing seasons. I just think that the more you sort of dig into it's the data, it's the narrative of the season. It just kind of felt like Nathan MacKinnon was kind of the main character of this NHL season in a way. Like he had the point streak. There's the whole thing about he's never won one before. I personally don't think that should matter, but it's going to matter to some people.
Right.
And I think there's a little bit of fatigue with Connor McDavid, which is also dumb. But again, that all matters in the end.
Consistent results.
Even like weird stuff like there's probably people out there who are going to not vote for Nikita Kucherov because he had a weird all-star break. There was like the whole, he didn't really care.
Power play goals. It's like, it's
right.
great. It's 5-5. Which, I'll give that a little bit of not. But
I think the vote is going to be crazy close. It's going to be the closest one probably ever. But I would suspect he's probably going to win, yeah.
And this is the real Nate question, but because he's been known around the league prior to you coming to Colorado and getting to know him a little bit more firsthand, has your perception of him changed if you learned a little bit more about who he is as a player?
Yeah, I think so. The one thing that's been weird about kind of dealing with him or getting to know him, he doesn't really I don't feel like I've really gotten to know him very well, right?
Yeah.
Which there are lots of players who are like that. It's just that he's like, one of the best players in the world. So you sort of like, I think that's one thing that like Sid has done a pretty good job of like letting people. Sidney Crosby is an insanely private person. Like he was dating the same person for a long time and people didn't even know about it, right? Like that's just not how famous people work. But he did, yeah. So I do. But there's like the one quirk about Nate is that he obsesses over the training, all the stuff. There was one. He gave one answer at the All-Star break where he was like, "I really enjoy." It basically, the way I interpreted it was, he gets more excited about like finding a new workout regimen online that he wants to try out than scoring a hat trick on a Thursday night in November, which I found so. But like that is fascinating to me. I would love to talk to Nate about where, like, does he read stuff online? Is it just does his trainer look for stuff, and why does he try new stuff? Why doesn't he just stick to what but he doesn't like talking about that, right? Like he gives great quotes about his teammates. He gives great quotes about like the work ethic and kind of culture of the team. But if you want to ask him about anything, it's kind of like state secrets, right? So,
do you think it was always like that, or do you think the way it was covered when we learned from Nikita Zadorov about diet that it kind of changed his willingness to talk about these things?
So one of the challenges for me with the job is, like when I was covering the Capitals, it was all the young guys coming up, and like I got to tell stories that people hadn't heard about them. Even in New Jersey, it was Nico Hischier, Jack Hughes, all those guys. Like getting to cover a young, bad team is actually pretty good as a journalist because it's kind of an open canvas. This team, everybody knows everything about Nate, Cale, those guys. Like there's not a lot of like new stories to tell with them because they've been around, they've won. And so I do think that like doing research on it, I mean, look, we know that Nate likes hip hop music. We know that Nate hates sugar and gluten. But those things were covered they were covered so much when he was younger. I do think that there's been kind of a fatigue. He's pulled back and doesn't want to necessarily, I'm sure he didn't like some of the jokes that came from the Zadorov stuff. He does. He doesn't really talk about music anymore. I feel like I read a lot of stories about him whenever he was younger about the different types of music that he liked. He doesn't really talk about that anymore.
Looking at the coaching matchup in this series too, of course the discussion has been how Pete DeBoer teams have foiled Bednar teams in the past. Do you still think this is a relevant conversation since these two teams are just different teams? How much do you think that coaching matchup is the chess match?
Yeah. Well, so for me personally, I've covered two teams that Pete used to coach, and both of those fan bases were like weirdly happy to see him go. And I personally think these are two of the best coaches in the NHL, right? And I think both have been underrated in certain ways. Like Pete is underrated because he hasn't won the Cup, but he's taken two teams to the Cup final. He's taken four teams to the conference finals. 8-0 in Game 7s. He's a great coach. And I think Jared is a great coach too. People kind of look at that as like, well, he's got a great team and he was just, holding the wheel steady. And I think we know that that's not necessarily true. Like they made adjustments against Winnipeg. They might have made some adjustments last night to how they were playing, how quickly it changed. So, no, I do think, I would say that probably from the outside, people thought of Peter DeBoer as like a better X's and O's coach than Jared Bednar. but I don't necessarily think that's like super duper true. I think they're both great. I think those two and John Cooper are probably the three best coaches in the league, and maybe throw Jim Montgomery in there too. He's pretty good.
It's a good nod. Right, I really respect
get a little you talking there, yeah, right.
Yeah, no, I really respect the.
Well, maybe someday we'll add Matt Carl to this list of NHL coaches.
It's incredible too because he sort of seems like on this track to just continue putting a bigger name for college hockey. But the NHL teams I thought honestly when they won the national title last time, the NHL teams have already been calling, so I don't doubt that those calls are getting more frequent for Carl.
It's wild. By the way, this was obviously my first time being around that program too. Like his record already, he's like almost won more NCAA tournament games than George Wozniacki, let alone Jim Montgomery. Yeah, I'm sure we will be at one of these things someday, and Matt Carl will be sitting at one of these tables talking to us.
His story is so incredible, and so is your story. You've earned a little bit of a reputation as the food guy to give recommendations on the road. Heavy is the crown. I wanted to know how you're embracing the pressures of being the food guy. Well,
this is like, just as an example, like Winnipeg I was excited for because I had been to Winnipeg before. I kind of knew that the food was underrated there, and it's like was kind of a secret. Obviously, we have collectively as a media corps have sung the praises of Winnipeg over the past couple weeks. Dallas is different. I know about some of the famous places here, but I don't have like a lot of experience of like, oh, this is the local place that you got to go. Yeah, that's usually like the thing that I enjoy. So it was. Everybody was like, where are we going in Dallas? And I'm like, I don't know every city, guys. But it's fun. Honestly, it's. I get questions from like media people or even from fans like, how do you find all these places?
Yeah.
And it's like, you go on the internet and look, and also too like just yesterday, right? We're sitting in the stands waiting for the morning skate to start. And Nick actually came over and was like, where are we going to eat for food?
Yes.
And one of the local guys like turned and was like, oh, do you guys want food recommendations? And I was like, yes, please.
Yeah.
And that's kind of how it works. You just, you find people that like food and you ask them where they eat and then.
Networking.
Yeah, networking, right? That's my little network of food people, yeah.
All of it runs through you. Speaking of heavy crowns, I'm almost getting scared to ask Cale Makar about anything impressive that he does because the levels of humility are reaching scary heights with him. And you have covered a lot of the league's top stars. So I was curious, how is Cale Makar different, similar, special to other league stars? Not just among defenders, just some of the top players at the height of their game.
Yeah. Well, okay, so like just as an example, my last season in San Jose was Erik Karlsson at 100 points, won the Norris Trophy. That was crazy. I hadn't really seen anything like that from a defenseman before. And it was a different circumstance because they were very bad, but when he was on the ice, they were good. Or they were like competitive, right? So they would have these games where it was like 5-4 and he had 3 points. Or they lose 5-4 and he had 3. How is he? He's different. He does take the humility thing almost to another level, right? Like, he scored literally that game in Winnipeg against Winnipeg was one of the best goals I've ever seen live, and he was like, I got lucky. He is. I went to Brooks, Alberta, where he played his junior hockey when we were in Western Canada, and one of the things that I thought was interesting was the coach in Brooks. He's coached a bunch of NHL guys, but obviously Cale sticks out. And whenever he was there, he said that Cale was reading books.
Yeah.
Which, right, and even like 16-year-old hockey players don't read books, whether it's Goosebumps or Harry Potter or whatever. But he's reading like self-help books, like mental toughness books. Like he's wired differently. And so then I asked Cale about it a couple weeks later, and he kind of got defensive because people have written about how he likes to read books. Yeah. And he in this weird way, he looks at it as like, well, I'm not an excellent reader. I don't read a book a week, so he's like, I can actually be a better reader. And I'm like, yeah, you read. Like I would like to be a better reader too, but I don't necessarily have time for it. So it is weird. He just has this like we always talk about the standard that the Avalanche hold themselves to. It's almost like Cale has that like in life too. And I think Nate's probably wired the same way, where it's like, oh man, I didn't order that thing on Amazon efficiently enough or something like that, right? Like it's just always about like, I can be better. So
even his acceptance of the King Clancy Memorial Award, like I haven't done enough acts of service, and it's like, but you still did acts of service.
Correct.
You can still take some ownership of this. Who has been your favorite guy to talk to in the room?
Favorite guy to talk to? That's a good question. I don't know if well, honestly, probably Devon Days, but like we've talked about it before. Like he doesn't really like doing media either. I don't think. Maybe it just comes off the way, but he is. I just like picking his brain. I just like the way he thinks about hockey and the way that I also just really enjoy watching him play. I think he's obviously there's all these super duper stars around him, and yet I still think that he's kind of the one of those five that sort of makes it all fit together. So yeah, it's probably. I mean, I wouldn't say that Devon is like the best quote on the team, but I do probably enjoy talking to him as much as anybody can.
That's a good call, because we get a lot of this thing. Mikko Rantanen and Jonathan Drouin's been really awesome.
Oh yeah, Joe is like he's been great. All right, and just it was so. I kind of have a funny Drouin story. I went to Halifax, so I went to Cole Harbour the first time that Nate and Sid played each other. I was in Cole Harbour to do a story on their youth coaches. After that was done, that was like one of the most amazing things I've done. I spent 2 days in Halifax. And the whole point of me going to Halifax was to write a story about Jonathan Drouin. Because while Nate was playing Sid, Jonathan was playing, Quebec Ramparts, and he didn't really want to be there. He thought he should have made the Lightning. And so I was there for NHL.com, and Jonathan wasn't in a great mood. The coach and the GM were both like, well, we know he doesn't really want to be here, but we'll give him some time and give him some space, and eventually it'll kind of snap back in. Yeah. So I go back to my bosses in New York City, and they're like, we can't run this story on NHL.com. Like that's a negative story. So, my first impression of Jonathan Drouin when he was 19 years old was, hey, he didn't really want to be there. He didn't really want to talk to me, et cetera, et cetera. And then flash forward, and even whenever he signed with Colorado, I talked to somebody who had covered him in Tampa Bay and somebody who had covered him in Montreal, and they're like, you're going to love him. He's amazing. And literally from day one, right? He's so happy. He's happy to talk to us. He's happy to, at one point someone, I think it was like very early on, someone was like, hey, sorry we kept you so long. And Jonathan's like, this is nothing compared to Montreal, right? Like, okay, yeah, okay. There's been a couple times where he's like, is that it? Sure. Okay. So, yeah. And he's also just a hockey nerd, man. Like he loves breaking down why Nate did a certain thing or why this power play worked. So he's pretty fun to talk to too.
I really appreciate that about him. Hopefully we get to see him at some point in this series.
Sounds like it, yeah.
What does Dallas need to do to counter Colorado moving forward?
Yeah. Well, that's a good question. They're figure out what they were doing well in the first period. But I kind of feel like the first couple times that they played this year, it was pretty run and gun, and it was very enjoyable for us to watch. I love watching these two teams play because it's just beep beep. But anyway, it feels like last night was more of a we need to be defensive, we need to slow them down, and I kind of wonder if Dallas might be better off just saying screw it, let's run with them. They played some pretty entertaining games in the regular season when it was like that. I think it's just the one thing that I've noticed, like one thing that Peter DeBoer said, one thing that Rick Bowness said, it's really stressful mentally to play the Avs because there are certain physical things that Nathan MacKinnon and Cale Makar can do that you don't have players that can do that. So you have to do this like one thing so perfectly every single time that they're out on the ice. And so it's really hard to do that over and over and over again. So, find some reserve of mental toughness that they don't necessarily thought they have. That's one way to do it.
I like this.
Put more pucks on Alexander Georgiev with a person in front of him. I think that's the...
I had seen because I think this is an adjustment Colorado had to make in the Winnipeg series, was finding more ways positionally to create screens, and I think that Dallas is going to have to do the same thing.
Yeah, I think Alex is, obviously his mental toughness and all that stuff. That's without reproach now, given what he's done in this postseason. But I do think that he's given up a handful of goals now on shots from the point with people in front of him. Like, that's what every goalie is like that. Connor Hellebuyck might be the best goalie in the world, and the Avs just, peppered him with goals like that. So that's probably the number one. It's like it's such a weird. You have to be fast enough to skate with them, but then you also have to be big enough to kind of bully them around the front of the net, and that's hard to do when they have Valerie Nichushkin and Arturi Lehkonen and it's just they do have a bunch of big fast dudes, and that's kind of the way to win.
I do like this idea of unchaining the talent in Dallas, even though it's riskier hockey. Maybe turn the keys over to some of the young guns. I really liked Wyatt Johnston. And I think that Pete DeBoer had to mix up the lines a little bit to sort of lean into the youth a little bit. That's not a direct shot at Joe Pavelski, but it does feel like we're going to see probably some changes from Dallas in Game 2.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, this isn't specific to this series, but I do think that this is round one of a several round fight between these. It just feels like it's lining up for maybe Connor Bedard and company will have some say in this eventually, but it just feels like Colorado and Dallas are going to be the two best teams in this division for the rest of this decade, right? Like Wyatt Johnston, Logan Stankoven, Thomas Harley, those guys are awesome. It is sort of right now it feels like Dallas is trying to catch Colorado, but I do wonder if in a couple of years it's going to flip and it's going to kind of be like Colorado is going to need Cal Ritchie and whoever they draft in this year's draft. They're going to need guys to kind of help them keep up with Dallas because, but you're right. I do think the more they can let those guys, and even in the regular season, there was when they called up Stankoven right in the middle of the year, right, and they played that one or two games against the Avs, and it was Johnston and Stankoven and Ben. That was their best line. They were better than Ince and Robertson. So I do think it's you hate to be hey kids, come do the job for us.
No pressure.
Right.
You kind of touched on this too, and it's my last question, but it is about goaltending on the whole and how it's played out through these playoffs. The conversation has kind of been, this is already an unpredictable position, and good goaltenders do get beat. But is it even more unpredictable than ever with goaltending? And then kind of where do you place Georgiev then in those conversations? It is,
it's just the whole goalies are voodoo thing is that's one of the I always kind of try to poke at some of the axioms that you need to that people think are true. I think goalies are, even Andrei Vasilevsky, who was the standard bearer for 3 or 4 years, is now kind of it's just very hard. I think kind of my general idea with goaltending is unless you know that you have one of the 5 best guys, you should do what the Avs have done. You should never give a 6-year contract to the 12th best goalie in the league. That's just my general. If you've got a Vasilevsky, if you've got a Thatcher Demko, that kind of guy, okay. But they've made the pads a little bit smaller. The players are obviously getting better and faster in front of them, so I think honestly, I guess it could change depending on what type of team you have, but for the Avalanche, they're going to score, right? So, would you rather have a very technical, what you're going to get B+ every single time,
right?
Or would you rather have a guy like Georgiev who, can make that ridiculous leg save whenever So I kind of think for me, the biggest thing with Alex is probably the mental stuff. I think we didn't know about that, and now just the way that Jared and even Nate and those guys talk about him now, he's he's their guy. He's a made man for them now that he's done what he's done. So I do think that's weirdly we just talked for a minute or whatever about all these kind of random things, but I think the mental side of the goaltending is probably the thing that the Avs people are most honed in on maybe.
No, it feels like that's maybe been, I don't want to say consistent, it feels too early to say that, but that has been the common thread in good Georgiev performances, and I actually feel more confidence now than I did in the regular season because of it. And the quick turnaround from Game 1 of Winnipeg. That's yesterday's problem. But that's all I had for you, but I want to invite you to tell everybody where to find all of your work.
Oh, okay. So I write for this little newspaper called the Denver Post. You might see it around. I mean, Twitter, Instagram, same. It's all C Masisak 22. So there's not a lot of hockey on Instagram. It's a lot of food and mountains, but that's,
But you've earned a reputation.
Yeah, so. Right. It's funny. My bio on Instagram has been like, if you like pictures of food in the mountains, you've come to the right place. That's been like that since before I lived in San Jose or Denver, where there are mountains. So it's been a good change for me, I guess.
You heard it here first. If you like food and you like mountains and the Colorado Avalanche, you should follow Corey.
Awesome.
Thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
And we'll continue our journey on the road here in Dallas.
Go get some barbecue.